This is Chapter 10, Democracy in America. We're looking at the years 1815 to 1840. Now, the career of Andrew Jackson, whose unprecedented inauguration drew in a crowd of about 20,000 people, they were very rambunctious. They crashed through the White House. He represented major developments of his era. His life and presidency reflected the power of the market revolution, westward expansion, the spread of slavery, and the growth of democracy. And he symbolized the self-made man, having risen from humble frontier background in South Carolina and Tennessee, and practiced law and served in the state's legislature and courts, all before winning fame through triumph at the Battle of New Orleans. And most important, Jackson represented the rise of political democracy. This first part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at what was the social basis for the flourishing democracy of the early to mid-19th century. One basis of political democracy in this period was the challenge to property qualifications for voting. It began in the American Revolution but did not culminate until the early 19th century. After the Revolution, no new state was requiring property ownership in order to vote. And in older states, constitutional conventions in the 1820s and 1830s were abolishing the property qualifications, partly because the growing number of wage earners were not owning much property, and they were also demanding the vote. In the South, however, where large slave owners dominated politics and they distrusted a mass democracy, property requirements were eliminated only gradually and disappeared quite late, not until about 1860. The personal independence required of a citizen was then located not in owning property, but in owning oneself, a reflection of the period's individualism. The single exception to this democratizing trend was Rhode Island, which required voters to own considerable real estate or rental property. The state was a center of factory production, and many wage earners could not vote. In 1841, reformers met at a People's Convention and drafted a new state constitution, which gave the vote to all adult men and also took it away from blacks. When the convention illegally ratified the Constitution and inaugurated a lawyer named Thomas Dorr as the governor, President John Tyler dispatched federal troops into the state and the movement collapsed, and this was known as the Dorr War. By 1840, more than 90% of adult men, white men, could vote. By then, America had a very vibrant democratic system that engaged massive numbers of citizens. Now, it did not have the traditional basis of nationality, as ethnicity, or religion that democratic political institutions imparted, instead a sense of identity to Americans. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French writer who visited the United States in the early 1830s, wrote of this political culture in his classic book, Democracy in America. As an aristocrat, Tocqueville disliked democracy, but his key insight was that democracy was more than just voting or political institutions. Democracy, to Tocqueville, was a culture that encouraged individual initiative, affirmed equality, and a public sphere full of voluntary organizations that wanted to improve society. Democracy was new. The idea that sovereignty resided within the masses of ordinary citizens was very much a departure in Western thought, which had traditionally viewed democracy as the road to anarchy. But in the United States, pressure from those originally excluded from political participation created a democracy for white men that triumphed in the age of Jackson. In America, the right to vote and participation in politics offered a sense of national identity. You can see here this anti-Jackson cartoon from 1832 portrays Andrew Jackson as an aspiring monarch. He's wielding the veto power while trampling on the Constitution. And this is Dorr Libertarian Stock, a certificate indicating that the person who had helped to finance Thomas Dorr and his appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court of his conviction for treason against the state of Rhode Island, and this is because of his role in the Dorr War. The court ruled against Thomas Dorr and he served 2 years in prison. Now, the market revolution and political democracy expanded the public sphere and the world of print. This information revolution was facilitated in part by the invention of the steam-powered printing press, which printed much more matter at far less of a cost. A new style of sensational journalism catered to mass readership, which was soon created in newspapers with total circulations of higher than that of all of Europe. Low postal rates and the growth of political parties had also sparked the expansion of print. Labor organizations, reformers, and even Native American tribes printed newspapers for the first time in American history, and the growth of print offered a new generation of women writers a venue for expression. You see The American Woman's Home, which is a guide to domestic life by the sisters Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Even though works like this were meant to instruct middle-class women on how to meet their domestic responsibilities, the popularity of them allowed talented women to take on a new public role as a writer. Now, as democratization expanded the number of people who participated in politics, it was necessary to define the boundaries of political nation and define freedom and who could enjoy it. Antebellum American political life was both expansive and exclusive. Democracy absorbed native-born white men and white immigrants, but it established barriers to women and non-white men's participation in that same democracy. The grounds for political exclusion shifted from economic dependency to natural incapacity. Gender and racial differences are now going to be seen as part of a single natural hierarchy of innate endowments. A natural boundary was not at all exclusive, many argued, and women and non-whites were deemed lacking in the qualities necessary for democracy and self-government. Now, while freedom for white men involved the process of personal transformation, of developing your potential to the fullest extent, democracy's limits rested on the idea that the character and abilities of non-whites and women's were fixed by nature, and the world of politics was partly defined against the feminine sphere of the home. Freedom in the public sphere in no way required freedom in the private sphere. In our nation, obsessed with equality and democracy, was becoming more and more associated with being white. While white Americans of all social classes dressed similarly and mixed in public, blacks were increasingly excluded from public life. Racist depictions of blacks in culture became widespread, and there was an ideology of racial superiority and inferiority, which alleged, with this alleged scientific basis, is going to take root where it never had before existed. After 1800, every state admitted to the United States except Maine limited voting rights to white males alone. In 1821, the New York State Constitutional Convention, that had removed the property qualifications for white voters, raised the requirement for blacks to $250, effectively disenfranchising nearly all New York blacks. Disenfranchising means essentially taking away their right to vote. By 1860, blacks could vote on the same basis as whites in only 5 New England states, which had only 4% of the nation's free black population. Whites of the Revolutionary era had considered blacks as potential members of the body politic, but in the 19th century, membership in this political nation was increasingly down to one race. No blacks had full equality before the law, and they were barred from schools, militia, and other public institutions. In effect, race is going to replace class as the boundary between American men and political freedom, and those without a process that incorporated many white immigrants into American democracy. Dandy Jim, this is a piece of sheet music from 1843. Minstrel shows, this is from sheet music that was used in a minstrel show, were forms of 19th century entertainment where white actors impersonated blacks. Here you can see the actors making fun of a black man attempting to adopt the style of middle-class white Americans. This next section, we're going to be looking at the efforts that were made during this time period to strengthen economic integration of the nation and what major crises it hindered these efforts. Now, the War of 1812 showed how far the United States was from being an integrated nation. The Bank of the United States had expired, transportation was poor, manufacturing had been required to counter the British embargo, and even though they wanted the United States to remain Jefferson's agrarian farming republic, Republicans led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun believed that manufacturers needed protection if the United States was to become independent from Britain. In 1815, President James Madison proposed a plan for government-promoted economic development that became known as the American System. This system would rest on a new national bank, a tariff on imports in order to protect and foster manufacturing within the United States, and federal financing of road and canal construction called internal improvement. Although the tariff and the national bank became law in 1816, Madison was afraid that the national government, if given powers not expressed in the Constitution, would interfere with individual liberty and slavery in southern states, and so he vetoed the internal improvement bill. The Second Bank of the United States, a private profit-making corporation that served as the government's financial agent, soon became resented by many Americans. The Bank of the United States was also tasked with regulating the volume of paper money that was printed by private banks in order to prevent fluctuations in inflation. At this point in American history, the federal government, did not print money. That was solely done by private banks. This is an image from a broadside from the campaign of 1824. This is promoting the American system of government, sponsoring economic development. The illustrations represent industry, commerce, and agriculture. The ship at the center is named John Quincy Adams. Its flag, no colonial subjection, suggests that without a balanced economy, the United States is going to remain economically dependent on Great Britain. Here's a picture of John C. Calhoun. Calhoun would evolve from a nationalist into probably the most prominent spokesperson for state sovereignty and the right of nullification. Now, rather than regulating the currency and loans that were issued by local banks, the Bank of the United States contributed to widespread speculation, mostly in land after the War of 1812. When European demand for American farm goods decreased in 1819, the speculative bubble burst. Dropping land prices ruined farmers and businessmen who could no longer pay their loans, banks failed, and unemployment spread in eastern cities. The short-lived Panic of 1819 disrupted the political harmony that had been established after the war's end. Some states controversially provided relief to debtors, much to the dismay and chagrin of the creditors. Most important, the panic reinforced many Americans' long-standing distrust of banks, and it undermined the reputation of the Bank of the United States, which was blamed for the panic. When the states retaliated against the Bank of the United States by taxing its local branches, the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, ruled in McCulloch v. Maryland that the Bank of the United States was a legitimate exercise of congressional authority under the Constitution. This directly contradicted the strict constrictionist view, which said that Congress could only use those powers expressed in the Constitution. In 1816, James Monroe becomes president, and he is inaugurating a period of one-party Republican rule, which is going to become known as the era of good feeling, in which almost no Federalists won federal or state elections and offices. In 1820, Monroe was reelected almost unanimously, and with no party opposition, however, politics are organized around competing sectional interests. Slavery was a sectional issue that threatened to disrupt national unity. In 1819, when Missouri applied for statehood, a New York Republican proposed that Congress force the new state constitution to ban the further importation of slaves and free slave children upon reaching the age of 25. The Republican Party split along sectional lines on the Missouri question. Most Northern Republicans supported the restrictions, while Southern Republicans opposed them. In 1820, a compromise was reached that allowed Missouri to adopt its own constitution without the anti-slavery restrictions, and at the same time allowed Maine, which prohibited slavery, to become a free state. And this was done in order to maintain the sectional balance between free and slave states in Congress. And slavery would then be prohibited in all remaining territories of the Louisiana Purchase, north of the 36th line of latitude. Now, the Missouri Compromise showed that sectional divisions over slavery's westward expansion were really going to endanger the Union. The domination of the presidency by Virginians since the founding, except for the term of John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, reinforced Northerners' sense that the Southern slave owners dominated national politics, and they knew that more slave states would mean more political power in the South in Congress. This issue is eventually going to help be one of the sparks that causes the Civil War. You can see this is the Missouri Compromise. It's temporarily going to settle the question of the expansion of slavery by dividing the Louisiana Purchase into free and slave areas. Now, in this next section, we're going to be looking at the major areas of conflict between nationalism and sectionalism. Now, between 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rebelled and established independent nations, which included Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. By 1825, Spain's empire in the Western Hemisphere contained only Cuba and Puerto Rico. Americans sympathized with these Republican revolutions, and the United States was first to recognize these new governments. John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, feared that Spain might try to regain its former colonies, and in 1823, he drafted a speech for the president that was later to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine stated that the United States would oppose any future efforts by European powers to colonize in the Americas, to abstain from involvement in Europe's wars, and to prevent European nations from interfering in the new Latin American nations. This doctrine assumed that the old and new world were separate political and diplomatic systems, and claimed that for the United States' role in the dominant power of the Western Hemisphere. Adams also meant to secure business of the region for the United States as opposed to British interests. You can see that this map shows the Western Hemisphere after most of the Spanish colonies achieved their independence. In the 1824 presidential election, only candidate Andrew Jackson, who is known for his military victories, had nationwide support. The other candidates, John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, William Crawford of Georgia, and Henry Clay of Kentucky, found support mostly just within their own regions. Now, though Jackson received the largest tally of the popular vote and carried all the regions except New England, none of the candidates received a majority of the Electoral College votes. So running last and eliminated, Henry Clay used his influence to lead the House of Representatives into electing John Quincy Adams as president. This is because Clay believed he would promote the American system. So what happens here is in the Electoral College, each state has the same number of votes as they have representatives in the House and in the Senate. Now, according to the Constitution, if no candidate receives a majority of those Electoral College votes, it is the job of the House of Representatives to then choose the president. Okay? Now, Clay was successful in getting John Quincy Adams to be elected president. He was soon appointed as Secretary of State, and this appointment led charges that a corrupt bargain between Clay and Adams had secured the presidency for Adams and laid the basis for the emergence of the Democratic Party behind Andrew Jackson's candidacy in the 1828 election. The alliance around Adams and Clay came to form the opposition Whig Party in the 1830s. Now you can see this is the map of the presidential election in 1824. See each state's electoral college votes are listed there as well. This picture of the White House in 1826. Now, John Quincy Adams had come from a privileged background. He was the son of the former President John Adams and had experience as a diplomat and senator in U.S. Congress. Now, despite his uncharismatic nature, John Quincy Adams was strongly nationalist. He supported the American system of government, sponsored economic development, and as author of the Monroe Doctrine, Adams wanted to increase American business and power within the Western Hemisphere. And he hoped that the United States would eventually incorporate Canada, Cuba, and even parts of Mexico. Adams had a much larger view of the federal national power than many at the time. He thought that the federal government should direct and sponsor internal improvements such as roads and canals, pass laws to promote agriculture and manufacturing and the arts, and he also wanted to establish a national university and naval academy. When many Americans believed government power threatened freedom, arguably Adams said that liberty was power. His ideas horrified believers in strict construction who wanted to limit the role of the federal government, and Congress approved very few of his programs. See, here's a picture of John Quincy Adams from 1843. Now, Adams rallied an opposition around Andrew Jackson that was dedicated to individual liberty, states' rights, and limited government. Jackson's campaign, organized by Martin Van Buren, a New York senator, started immediately after Adams took office. Now, while Adams typified old politics where elites ruled, Van Buren, the son of a tavern keeper, represented this new era in American politics in which the ordinary man could become party managers and professionals and would be able to wield great power. Van Buren believed political parties and party competition were legitimate and were good for the republic because they checked the power of administration and gave voters choice. He also believed that parties would suppress sectionalism by bringing together supporters and candidates from all across the country. Van Buren was alarmed by the sectionalism that was inspired by the slavery question in the Missouri debates, and he hoped to resurrect the Jeffersonian alliance between Southern planters and Northern farmers and urban workers. By 1828, Van Buren had created a very vibrant Democratic Party that embodied this alliance. By using new techniques to mobilize mass voter turnout, he had helped to elect Jackson to become president in a huge majority over Adams. This is in the 1828 election. This is a broadside from that election. It shows how Andrew Jackson's supporters promoted him as a military hero and a man of the people. Here's a map of the presidential election of 1828. You see that Jackson took on a great share of the electoral vote. This next section, we're going to look at the ways that Andrew Jackson embodied the contradiction of democratic nationalism. Now, Andrew Jackson was a man of contradictions. He was not well educated, but yet he was very eloquent. He championed the common man, but excluded Indians and African Americans from democracy. He rose from modest origins to become a rich man and slave owner in Tennessee. He disliked banks and paper money, and some of the results of the market revolution. He was a strong nationalist who believed that states, not the federal government, should govern, and he opposed federal intervention in the economy or interference in public life. Now, by Jackson's presidency, politics was a mass activity, engaging the masses of Americans constantly and penetrating all spheres of life. It was a mass spectacle with enormous meetings, party newspapers, parades, and celebrated politician orators. Large national conventions replaced congressional caucuses and nominate candidates. Political parties and urban political machines dispensed patronage in the forms of jobs, assistance, and other benefits. And Jackson himself introduced the spoils system, in which a new administration replaced previously appointed officials with his own party's appointees. Now, this picture shows stump speaking. This is a painting from the 1850s done by George Caleb Bingham, and it shows a candidate in a country election that is addressing a group of voters. This is an illustration of what we would call grassroots democracy in action. One of the listeners appears to question or challenge the speaker, and his paintings generally depict scenes from the American West, including exploration landscapes and life on the Missouri and Mississippi River. But he was also fascinated by democratic politics. A founder of the Whig Party in Missouri, Bingham himself ran for office several times and was elected to the state legislature in 1848. This is a procession of victuallers. It's a lithograph that's commemorating a parade of butchers through the states of Philadelphia in 1821. Their banner, "We Feed the Hungry," illustrates the belief among members of the producing classes that their work led to practical benefits for society, unlike the activities of non-producers like bankers. Politics in the age of Jackson concerned issues associated with the market revolution and tensions between national and sectional loyalties. Political debate centered on banks, tariffs, currency, and internal improvements, and the balance of power between national and local authority. The market revolution shaped many party positions. Democrats tended to be alarmed with the growing gap between social classes and warned that non-producers, like bankers, merchants, and speculators, were using connections with the government to enhance their wealth, to the disadvantage of the producers, like farmers, artisans, and laborers. They wanted government to avoid interfering with the economy and to not give special favors to economic interests. Without government interference in the market, ordinary Americans would fairly compete in self-regulating market, and the most notorious would succeed. Democrats tended to be upcoming businessmen, farmers, and urban workers. Now, Whigs supported the American system, believing that protective tariff, internal improvements, and a national bank could develop the economy and spread prosperity for all classes. They were strongest in the Northeast and the most modernized region. Many bankers and businessmen supported their program, as did farmers near rivers, canals, and other waterways. While many slaveholders supported the Democrats, who believed in states' rights protected slavery, the largest Southern planters voted Whig. You can see in this county election, another painting by George Galen Bingham shows American democracy in action. This is in 1852, showing a voter taking an oath while party workers give out liquor, seek to persuade voters, and keep track of who's cast ballots. The banner on the pole reads, "The will of the people, the supreme law." This slogan was meant to be ironic. Bingham is including a number of Democratic politicians who he accused of cheating him in a recent election. Now, party battles of the Jacksonian era reflected the conflict between public and private definitions of American freedom and their relationship to government power. To Democrats, liberty was a private entitlement best protected by local governments and threatened by powerful national states. With Jackson, the national government's power decreased. Weak federal power ensured private freedom and states' rights. So Democrats under Jackson reduced spending, lowered the tariff, killed the national bank, and refused federal aid for internal improvements. States thus replaced the federal government as the main economic actors, planning roads and canal systems and chartering banks and other corporations. Democrats also thought individual morality was a private concern and opposed any attempts to impose a uniform moral vision on society, such as temperance laws, restricting the banning of production and sale of liquor, or Sabbath laws, which would ban business on Sundays. This is one reason why Irish and German immigrants tended to vote Democrat. Democrats supported the policies that enhanced the free agency of individuals, leaving them free to make their own decisions and pursue their own interests. Whigs believed that liberty and power reinforced one another, and they thought that an energetic federal government enhanced freedom and liberty required a prosperous and moral America. Government would create the conditions for economic development, producing prosperity for all classes and regions. Like the Federalists, wealthy Whigs saw society as a hierarchy of social classes, but unlike the Federalists, they believed that class status was not fixed. Individuals, through hard work, could rise in society. Whigs also believed that the government should intervene in individual life to ensure that they acted as free moral agents. Thus, they supported schools, temperance laws, and Sabbath laws. Now, dedicated to states' rights, Jackson's first term saw his efforts to uphold federal supremacy over the states. The 1828 tariff, which raised taxes on imported goods, aroused opposition in the South, particularly in South Carolina, where it was called the Tariff of Abominations. Believing the tariff punished Southern consumers in order to benefit Northern industry, South Carolina's legislature threatened to nullify it. That is, they were going to declare it null and void in South Carolina. South Carolina had a higher percentage of slaves than any other state and was ruled by an oligarchic elite of large plantation owners. And these owners were alarmed by the Missouri controversy and growing federal power. Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, developed this theory of nullification. In it, he argued that states had created the national government, and each state retained the right to prevent the enforcement of Congress's laws within its border if it seemed to exceed the powers written in the Constitution. Opponents such as Daniel Webster argued that the people, not the states, had created the Constitution and the federal government, and that nullification was illegal, unconstitutional, and treasonous. You can see here in this cartoon, it was published in 1833 at the height of the nullification controversy. It shows John C. Calhoun climbing steps, including those marked nullification, treason, and civil war, toward the goal of despotism. He is flanked by James H. Hammond, Robert Y. Hayne, which are two of South Carolina's political leaders. At the right, President Andrew Jackson threatened to hang them. This is an 1834 print that shows the United States as a temple of liberty. The center, a figure of liberty, rises from the flames holding the Bill of Rights and a staff with the liberty cap. Justice and Minerva, which is the Roman goddess of war and wisdom, are on either side of the temple, above which flies a banner saying the Union must and shall be preserved. Now, while no other state threatened nullification, Calhoun's theory offered the South a political philosophy to use when sectionalism intensified. Calhoun argued that the theory did not threaten disunion, but instead preserved it, allowing unique and diverse states to preserve their interests while remaining part of the federal union. To President Jackson, however, nullification was disunion. In 1832, when a new tariff was enacted, South Carolina declared it would be null and void the next year. In response, Jackson persuaded Congress to authorize him to use the military to collect the tariff in South Carolina. In order to avoid war, Henry Clay, along with Calhoun, created a compromise tariff in 1833 that reduced the taxes. South Carolina rescinded the nullification law, and Calhoun abandoned his Democratic Party and Jackson for the Whigs, and Clay and Webster, where they were united only by their hatred for Jackson. Andrew Jackson, dedicated states' rights and limited government, had defended the power of the federal government and the idea of the Union against states' rights. Now, Jackson's nationalism and commitment to national sovereignty also showed when looking at his policy toward Indians. The last Indian resistance in the Old Northwest ended in American victory in the Black Hawk War of 1832. In the South, cotton's spread introduced land-hungry white settlers into the areas where civilized tribes such as Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek had long practiced white ways, including slavery. But in 1830, Jackson secured passage of the Indian Removal Act, which allowed for the removal of tens of thousands of Indians from the Southwest. The law repudiated Jeffersonian notions that the Indians could be assimilated and eventually incorporated into white America. The Cherokee in Georgia, threatened with expulsion by that state government, had their own constitution, schools, and an English newspaper. They appealed to the Supreme Court to protect their land rights, which had been guaranteed in treaties with the federal government. In 1832, the court decided that the Indians did not in fact own their land, but rather were nomads who had the right of occupancy. Another Supreme Court decision defined Indians as wards of the federal government. They did not have full rights as citizens and were not independent nations sovereign from state governments. A subsequent decision seemed to reverse this judgment, giving Indian nations a separate political identity to be dealt with by the federal government, not the states. But Jackson refused to enforce his last decision and instead let Georgia expel the Cherokee with the help from the federal government. The federal government sent troops or forcibly removed the Cherokee and other tribes in the 1830s. The Indians were forced to move to territories in the West with inferior land, and thousands died on the way. In Florida, the Seminoles resisted removal for 7 years by fighting a costly guerrilla war against American troops, but they too succumbed. By 1840s, Indians had all but disappeared as a visible presence in the eastern states of America. See Black Hawk and his son Whirling Thunder in this painting that was printed in 1833 by the artist John Wesley Jarvis. This was shortly after the Black Hawk War. Jarvis hoped that the traditional Indian ways, symbolized by the sun's dress, would be replaced by Black Hawk's civilized appearance. You also see here, this is a lithograph from 1863 depicting Sequoyah with the alphabet of the Cherokee language that he developed. Because their written language and constitution, the Cherokee were considered by many white Americans to be a civilized tribe. And this map here shows the Indian removals from 1830 and 1840. This next picture, The Trapper and His Family, was done by the artist Charles Diaz, and it shows a white pioneer married to an Indian woman. And this is buffalo chased over the prairie bluffs. They're actually North American bison. And this painting, done by the 1830s by George Catlin, he had created dozens of works depicting Native Americans in the Trans-Mississippi West. He saw himself as recording for the future this vanishing way of life. At the time, millions of buffalo inhabited the West and provided food and hides for Native Americans. Now this next section, we're going to talk about the Bank War influencing the economy and party competition. Now, the most significant political fight of the Jacksonian era was Jackson's campaign against the Bank of the United States, which to many represented the hopes and anxieties caused by the market revolution. While banking's growth had spurred economic development, many distrusted bankers because they were non-producers. They gave nothing to the nation's real wealth and yet still profited from the labor of others. Banks also tended to overissue paper money, whose deterioration in value reduced the real income of wage earners. Jackson and others now thought that hard money, gold and silver, was the only honest currency. The aristocratic Nicholas Biddle directed the Bank of the United States, and he celebrated the bank's power to control America's financial system. This alarmed Democrats, and in 1832, Biddle's allies persuaded Congress to extend the bank's charter for another 20 years, even though it had been sent to expire in 1836. Jackson saw this as blackmail, since he believed that the Bank of the United States would use its resources to defeat him in the 1832 election if he vetoed the bill. So he did veto it, and his veto message resonated with popular values. He stated that Congress could not create an institution with such power and economic privilege that was unacceptable to voters. Exclusive privileges like the Bank of the United States Charter widened the gap between the wealthy and the humble farmers and mechanics and laborers whom Jackson claimed to defend. The Bank War allowed Jackson to enhance the power of the presidency, and he was the first president to use the veto as a major weapon and directly address voters over the heads of Congress. Jackson's re-election in 1832 over the Whig candidate Henry Clay assured the demise of the Bank of the United States. Now this political cartoon, The Downfall of Mother Bank, is celebrating the destruction of the Second Bank of the United States. President Jackson toppled the building by brandishing his order removing federal funds from the bank. Led by Nicholas Biddle with the head of a demon, the bank's corrupt supporters flee, and among them is Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and newspaper editors who were allegedly paid by the institution. Now, the question remains of what would replace the Bank of the United States. Jackson's veto was supported by two groups: state bankers who wanted to free themselves from Biddle's regulations and issue more paper currency, which was called soft money, and hard money advocates who opposed all banks, whether chartered by the states or the federal government, and thought that gold and silver was the only reliable currency. Jackson, wanting to dissolve the Bank of the United States before 1836, removed federal funds from the Bank of the United States and deposited them into local and state banks. Political and personal connections were often determined by the choice of which pet banks got federal funds. And without government deposits, the Bank of the United States lost its ability to regulate the state banks' activities. State banks issued more and more paper money to finance economic development, and the value of banknotes in circulation skyrocketed from $10 million in 1833 to $149 million just 4 years later in 1837. Prices rose, real wages declined, and speculators prospered. Now, the speculative bubble inevitably is going to burst. The federal government sold 20 million acres of land in 1836, 10 times the 1830 amount, and almost all of it paid for by paper money, which had questionable value. In July of 1836, Jackson issued the Specie Circular, mandating land payments to the federal government be made in hard currency. Simultaneously, British banks demanded that their creditors pay them in hard currency as well, and a recession in Britain dropped demand for American cotton. Together, these events caused an economic crisis, the Panic of 1837, which was followed by a depression that lasted until 1843. Businesses failed, workers lost their jobs, farmers and others lost their lands, states that had taken up economic development projects defaulted on their debts. The new president in 1836 and Jackson's lieutenant, Martin Van Buren, represented the hard money, anti-bank wing of the Democratic Party. In 1837, Van Buren announced that he hoped to remove federal funds from pet banks and keep them in the Treasury Department, which was directly under federal control. Only in 1840 did Congress approve this policy, which is known as the Independent Treasury, which completely separated the national government from banking. It was repealed in 1841, but then restored in 1846. Now, Van Buren, not as popular as Jackson, and by 1840, the Whigs had mastered the political techniques the Democrats had used to mobilize voters. The Whigs nominated that year for President William Henry Harrison, a war hero from the War of 1812. He had no platform, but was portrayed as a common man who grew up in a log cabin and drank cider. His running mate was John Tyler, a states' rights Democrat from Virginia who had joined the Whigs after the nullification crisis. The Whigs sold their candidate much better than the Democrats had sold Van Buren to the public, and with a record voter turnout of 80% of eligible voters, Harrison won a sweeping victory. Now, Harrison soon contracted pneumonia and died, making John Tyler an accidental president. When the Whig majority of Congress attempted to enact the American System into law, Tyler returned to his Democratic principles and vetoed every measure, including a new national bank and a higher tariff. His cabinet resigned, and the Whigs repudiated him. In the new age of Jacksonian democracy, presidents could not rule without political parties, and Tyler accomplished very little in his 4 years in office. This is the Times, an 1837 engraving that blames Andrew Jackson's policies for the economic depression. The custom house is idle, while next door the bank is mobbed by worried depositors. Beneath Jackson's hat, spectacles, and clay pipe, the ironic word glory on it, images of hardship abound. You can see here this map of the presidential election in 1840.